Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Damayra Figueroa Lazu, and I am the Data Hub Coordinator for Centro. And I welcome and thank you for attending our Data Hub teach-in, Puerto Rico's Child Vulnerability Index 2021, Exploring Children Vulnerability Across the Puerto Rican Archipelago. The Centro Data Hub team follows Centro's vision and mission through the creation of knowledge of the Puerto Rican people through data-driven approaches that highlight problems or help develop solutions to some of the problems Puerto Ricans both in the diaspora and Puerto Rico face. We produce and provide a range of materials that can be useful to you, such as data requests, infographics, tools, and reports. Here today we have with us Jorge Soldevila Irizarry, our Data Hub GIS Specialist, and Colon Melendez, our Data Hub Scientist, to discuss the Puerto Rico Child Vulnerability Index.
All right. Thanks, Damayra. Thank you all for being here. I'm glad to see people from different areas. And like Damayra was saying, we're here to talk about a bit. We're here to talk a little bit about one of our most latest tools, which is the Puerto Rico Child Vulnerability Index for 2021. And sort of we're gonna start a little bit talking about what that entails and some of the context behind why such a tool or thinking about child vulnerability is important. And I think we can start acknowledging that, thinking about how we think or reason about vulnerability, and usually we do so in relationship to the physical environment. Puerto Rico, as many of you know, is susceptible to many natural hazards, including storms, hurricanes, landslides, earthquakes, wildfires, and many others. And as the planet warms, we can expect these hazards to become more common. The last 7 years in the archipelago have been particularly intense. At least 6 events have been declared federal disasters. These obviously include Hurricanes Irma and Maria, Hurricane Fiona in 2022, the 2020 earthquakes in the southwestern region, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Natural hazards do not only cause damage to the physical environment, but they can also negatively affect people, particularly those who are the most vulnerable. And this focus on like the physical environment. Usually, we can understand it, and from a standpoint, if we think of Puerto Rico and recent events, we've seen what they can cause now in terms of like the destructions to like housing and schools and other structures, and sometimes it even affects agriculture. And remember, after Hurricane Fiona, a lot of the plantain stock in the island was wiped out, and many of us who were there for that Christmas were searching around trying to find plantains to make different food during the festivities. And so we can think about them in that sense, but when we consider vulnerabilities, particularly to natural hazards, we also have to keep in mind not only the physical vulnerabilities that they entail, but also social vulnerabilities. Social vulnerabilities are socioeconomic and demographic characteristics that affect a person or group's resilience. They are known to increase susceptibility to adverse outcomes of hazardous events, limiting individuals' capacities to prepare, withstand, and recover from disasters. Social vulnerabilities are dynamically complex phenomena that exhibit varying spatial and temporal patterns, and some of it we'll get into later on today. And what we're trying to say here is that if we understand these social vulnerabilities, we can improve disaster managers' capacity to identify vulnerabilities or vulnerable populations and understand their necessities and service those communities better. It can also help local communities understand their own vulnerabilities and necessities and prepare accordingly for future events. Knowledge of these vulnerabilities can be used to improve funding allocation, improve knowledge of supply requirements, help identify areas in need of shelters, improve evacuation plans, and et cetera, and other benefits that you might think of. And obviously, there's a question now of how do we measure vulnerability? How do I determine, or how do people determine which locations, which communities are more vulnerable than others? How do I say that some barrio in Ponce is more vulnerable than some barrio in Santa Isabel or something like that, Uh, and one of the ways that it is most commonly done is through what are known as social vulnerability indexes. Social vulnerability indexes, or SVIs as they're known, are generally built by aggregating distinct social indicators, think poverty, housing occupancy, underemployment, unemployment, and they get added up through some mathematical formula which determines which locations are more vulnerable than others. And one of the most used SBIs is the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. And this one measures the capacity communities have to prepare and respond to natural anthropogenic events, which may be affected by, again, some certain social conditions, including some of the ones that I mentioned: poverty, age composition, disability, and a number of others. What we're seeing here on the screen actually is the CDC Social Vulnerability Index put in a map. And if we look at the map and where we are at today, which we're based in New York City, we can see, for example, if we expand the legend, and we notice that darker colors represent more vulnerable areas, and we can see from the map that parts of uh, New York City, including Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, are highly vulnerable locations, and sort of those vulnerabilities also extends to parts of New Jersey and around like Patterson and Essex County. And if we zoom out a little bit more, we can begin seeing like those patterns extend a little bit, the start of like upper New York, and they sort of stretch also towards Hartford and Springfield, Connecticut, Springfield, Massachusetts. And we can also see some high levels of vulnerability around county, like Philadelphia County, which are places that have a high volume of Puerto Ricans living in them. So we do have a sense that Puerto Ricans live in vulnerable areas. And sort of we keep zooming out and take a look at the United States as a whole, or at least the mainland US. We can also start identifying different patterns of vulnerability. And this time we see that there's a corridor of vulnerability that sort of stretches through what's historically been known as the Southern Black Belt, which sort of stretches from East Texas moving up to North Carolina, sometimes going into Delaware. And we see also pockets of higher vulnerability across areas that border with Mexico, where we also know that there's high concentrations of what are known as colonias, which is people, a lot of them Mexican or of Mexican heritage, living in poor housing conditions with little or to no access to basic needs like water. And these are measures that are generally used, and they're very commonly used to think about social vulnerability, but they do have some limitations. Usually they rely on census or nationally representative surveys, which have data lags of several years or even decades. I mean, we're in 2023 talking about a child vulnerability index for 2021 because that's what we can build, you know? And it limits our capacity to provide knowledge about what is currently happening. Even the map that I was showing you, for example, the CDC does measure SVI for Puerto Rico, but I couldn't show it to you there because it does so separately from the whole United States, and that limits our comparative analysis, our capacity to do some comparative analysis. No, and like for territories like Guam, for example, building such indices may be even impossible because the required data is barely available. Recently, some researchers went and took upon the task of creating an SVI for Guam, and they could only do so for 2010 because the decennial census is the only one that has the data that they needed to build such a thing. Reliance on those types of statistics risks also missing local context that influence vulnerability. In Puerto Rico, like in other territories, our conceptions of race and ethnicity differ significantly from the US, and not accounting for those may lead to key factors being ignored from analysis. SVIs have also been noted for missing key variables like gender or minority status. And similarly, the data that we use risk also missing certain population groups. Going back to local context, in Puerto Rico, children are defined as those under the age of 21, which is contrary to the more common definition of people under the 18 years of age. that data gap risks us missing portions of one of the most vulnerable populations. And children are one of the, if not the most vulnerable population groups, because they have not fully developed their physical or emotional capacities. And this limits how they can cope or respond to hazardous events, which means that they are dependent on their families and the broader community whenever events occur. Uh, I've mentioned before, hazardous events can have significantly negative effects on children, particularly those that are more socially vulnerable. I mentioned before poverty, and poverty is one of the key measures of social vulnerability. The poorer you are, the more vulnerable. And in Puerto Rico, if we compare to the three poorest states in the United States, which are Louisiana, New Mexico, and Mississippi, we can see that although the population of children under 18 years of age in the archipelago is lower than those in those three states at 18% roughly, 56% of children in Puerto Rico live below the poverty level, which is double that of any of the three states. 62% live in single-parent households, which is higher than in any of those states. And it's also a known metric of vulnerability, particularly related to poverty, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. And 8% have some type of disability, which is also associated to greater vulnerability. But to sort of look more into how children in Puerto Rico are vulnerable, how poverty affects them, I'm going to leave you guys with Laura, who's going to talk a little bit more about this.
Thank you, Jorge. I'm Laura Colon Melendez. Before diving into the data that pertains to child poverty in Puerto Rico and how this relates to child vulnerability, we want to acknowledge the sources of our background information. In 2014, the Universidad Interamericana de Puerto Rico published a volume titled Poverty in Puerto Rico, a Socioeconomic and Demographic Analysis with Data from the Puerto Rico Community Survey 2014, edited by Carmen Nazario, and it contains a very detailed, excellent chapter on child poverty, in particular in Puerto Rico by demographer Raúl Figueroa Rodriguez, from which we derive inspiration for our analysis on child poverty. Diving into data now. Children, that is the population under 18 years of age, and remember the caveat that Jorge mentioned that in Puerto Rico, children are defined as the population under 21, but the census defines them as under 18 years of age, are the poorest segment by age in Puerto Rico. As you can see here, the population under 18 years of age has a poverty rate as of the 2021 ACS 5-year survey of 56.3%. The overall population has a poverty rate of 42.7%, and the population that is at or above 18 years of age is 39.7% living below the poverty level. When we consider the population of children under 5 years of age, they are poorer than the rate of nearly 62%. Now, looking at this table at the bottom, regardless of the dramatic reduction in the total child population and the reduction in the proportion of the total population that is under 18 years in the last decades, poverty rates remain constant, nearly constant for the under 18-year-old population. So you can see that from 2000, we went from 1.1 million children that were more than a quarter of the population to 560,000 children in 2020, which were 17% of the population, but the poverty rate in 2000 was 58%, and in 2020, it's still 56.5%. So why do we care about child poverty? Well, poverty deprives children of quality services in education and health and makes them socially vulnerable. Outcomes for children who grow up in poverty include poor health, limited access to quality education, and this leads to low-wage employment and unemployment in adulthood. So now let's focus on the family, because it's all about the family. Children are poor because the adults in their families are poor. Children living in households with one parent, particularly single mothers, are more likely to live below the poverty level, which hinders our capacity to cope during a disaster. When we take a closer look at family composition, and we look at the total number of all families in Puerto Rico, we see that 55% are married couple families, and the other 45% are male or female-headed, no spouse-present households. However, when we look at families with related children of the household, they're under 18 years old, which is about 39% of all families, this proportionality flips. 58.8% of them are male or female-headed, no spouse-present families, and 41.2% are married couple families. So when we deal with families with children, there are more single-parent families than married couple families. When we look then at the poverty level, 52.2% of families with related children of the householder live below the poverty level. Nearly 30% of married couple families with related children of the householder live below poverty, but then more than double, or 68.1% of one-parent, no spouse-present family households with related children present are poor. Again, I want to emphasize these are numbers from 2021 American Community Survey 5-year microdata. So now when we look at the number of related children of the householder, there's over 590,000 related children of the householder under 18 years of age. 41% live in married couple family households, and 59% in one parent, no spouse present family households. So more children live with one parent than in married couple families. When we look at the poverty level, 56.2% of all of these 590,000 children live below the poverty level. 33% of them live in married couple families. 33% of children, 33% of children in married couple family households live in poverty, but 72.6% of children in one parent, no spouse present family households live in poverty. Next, we want to look at the poverty by the number of workers in family households with related children present, because as I mentioned beforehand, children are poor because their adults in their families are poor, and the adults in their families are poor because of economic labor conditions. So going back to Raul Figueroa Rodriguez's work, the elevated number of children that live in single parent families alongside a considerable number of families with just one or none of the parents in the labor force is a recipe for producing and reproducing high poverty levels. Families with related children of the householder under 18 years old with no workers in the past year experience extremely high poverty rates regardless of family type. You can see 91.5% of all such family households had lived below poverty. The poverty rates decreased significantly to 55% when you just have one worker in the family in the past 12 months for all family types, regardless of the quality of that work, whether it was full-time year-round or part-time work. Let's look at two different kinds of maps to give some visual context to this information. So I'm going to show you a map of child poverty in Puerto Rico at the barrio level. I'm going to zoom in here. I already showed the legend. I'm going to zoom in. So 56.3% of the overall child population in Puerto Rico lives below the poverty level. But you can see that throughout the island, look, these darker colors are numbers that are higher than that 56.3%. You have 62% or above with this dark blue and darker blue colors here. It's spread around the island pretty uniformly. So there's no particular region of the island where child poverty is greater or lower than other regions. When we then look at other social conditions of children in Puerto Rico, particularly children that live with one parent, due to the background that I just mentioned, we perform the same exercise of showing the legend, expanding the map, and zooming. We can see that in Puerto Rico, overall, 62% of children in households live in family households with one parent, whether male or female, present, and no spouse present in the family household. You can see that there are certain regions, looking here at this dark blue color, particularly in the center region of the island, where that proportion is higher than 80%. And you have to think about what this means in terms of this children's vulnerability and their ability to cope and their susceptibility to disaster. So to highlight the vulnerabilities of children in Puerto Rico, we developed the Child Vulnerability Index as a tool that takes into account local context and variations in scale to model the landscape of child vulnerability in Puerto Rico. The tool follows a similar methodology to that of the Social Vulnerability Index that Jorge mentioned beforehand, but we take into account literature and local experts' feedback so that we can make it custom to Puerto Rico. In doing so, we created a two-pronged tool, which consists of an Esri enterprise dashboard, which Jorge will later demo. And we also used open source Python code to capture the landscape of vulnerability of Puerto Rican children at 3 distinct geographic levels: municipios, barrios, and census tracts. To construct the CVI, we took into account 14 different variables, which we organized into 3 themes. So theme 1 is the personal characteristics of children, and is comprised of these 5 different variables: the child population percent, the child poverty percent, the child disability percent, the child healthcare and insurance percent, and the percent of children who are not enrolled in school. Theme 2 describes characteristics of households where children live, which comprises these 5 different variables, 2 of them having to do with family composition: percentage of children in households with grandparents and no parent present, percent of children in households with 1 parent present. And then we look at how many children live in households receiving cash assistance, the percentage of children living in households without internet, and the percentage of children living in households without a computer. Theme 3 describes overall household and community characteristics. We take into consideration the percent of housing cost burden households, the percent of the civilian population that is unemployed. Civilian population is that population over 16 years of age or older. We take into consideration the percentage of occupied housing that is overcrowded or more than 1 person per room. And we take into consideration the percentage of occupied households that have no vehicle. So, to give you a brief flavor of how we actually built the CVI, we extracted over 100 estimates from 3 different data sets from the American Community Survey from the 2021 5-year, meaning spanning from 2017 to 2021, American Community Survey, to construct then these 14 variables that I just mentioned. We followed the methodology that the CDC Social Vulnerability Index utilizes to compute the overall CVIs. That mathematical formula that Jorge mentioned is just calculating percentile ranks. If you have any questions, we can answer at the end. And just to mention that a CVI, or an index close to 0, indicates lower relative child vulnerability, whereas a CVI close to 1 indicates greater relative child vulnerability. And to reiterate, we constructed the CVI for municipios, barrios at census tract level. So I'm going to show you 1 variable for each one of the themes. When we look at theme 1, we focus here on child population percentage. And even though overall for Puerto Rico, the child population percentage was 18%, you can see, following this legend, that there are certain barrios where you have more than 35% of the total population in that location be children. There's no particular region of the island, perhaps with the exception of this area here in Yauco, that has more or less children than in any of these others. There are plenty of barrios with more than the 18% overall proportion of children in Puerto Rico in their total population. Moving on to a variable from theme 2, we look at households with children with no computer. Think about having no access to computer. This makes you vulnerable because you then are unable to access information easily, or during the pandemic, children were not able then to do schoolwork as easily as others that have access to a computer and have access to internet. So even though the overall percentage of households with children with no computer is 8.3% in Puerto Rico, if you look here, zooming in, these darker colors have 70% of such households with children having no computer, again, in these poor central regions of the island. So looking at a variable then from theme 3, we focus on occupied households with no vehicle present. We think of Puerto Rico as a place where everyone has a car. This is actually not the case. 14.7% of occupied households in Puerto Rico have no vehicle. And zooming in, expanding the map, we can see these darker colors here, which again are thrown about in mountainous regions of the island. You have more than 30% of occupied households with no vehicle, and this makes you susceptible during an emergency. If you have flooding or landslides going on, you're unable to leave the area. So now that we have shown you some of these variables and the different scales that we look at, let's talk about the landscape of child vulnerability in Puerto Rico. As I mentioned beforehand, we computed the CVI at 3 different geographic levels. Yet we focus, and we have focused thus far on barrio, but we will focus on municipios and barrios for the sake of presentation. We don't know what census tract we're from. We know what municipio or barrio our families or we are from. If we look at municipios only, actually, before I mention that, I want to mention the spatial distribution of child vulnerability is widespread in the island and geographically uneven. 77 of 78 municipios in the island, so most of them, except for Culebra, contain at least one barrio with CVI greater than or equal to 0.5. And 75% of all municipios, or 59% of them, contain barrios in all CVI quartiles. What we want you to get out of this slide is that the spatial distribution of child vulnerability is very widespread in the island. Let's look at 2 municipios in particular. I'm going to expand this, and I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to look at 2 municipios in particular. That was too much zoom. So I'm going to look at Ponce, and I'm going to look at Guaynabo. Ponce is a municipio that has this dark color represents high CVI. Guaynabo is a municipio that has low CVI. But this doesn't paint the complete picture. Scale is important. A municipio like Ponce has high CVI, but, and I'm going to zoom in another level so that you can appreciate the detail here. A municipio like Ponce, when we looked at it at municipio level, it had high CVI, but Ponce has more than 30 barrios. And there's barrios in Ponce that have low CVI, like Barrio Maragüez, Cerrillos, Montellano. And then you have barrios like Barrio San Antón, Cañas Urbano, Cañas Playa, etc., which have high CVI. Now, a municipio like Guaynabo, again, zooming out of here and looking for Guaynabo. This is a pretty nifty tool that we can use to explore these maps. A municipio like Guaynabo, which is right here, I'm going to center it. Has low CVI. It's here painted in a light yellow color. But when we look at the barrio level, we see that, again, it has barrios. I may have zoomed too much, pardon. It has barrios here. This is the municipio of Guaynabo. It has barrios in all CVI quartiles. The Guaynabo Pueblo, the center or casco urbano of Guaynabo, has high vulnerability, as do a lot of other barrio pueblos in the municipios of Puerto Rico. So, escaping this map, I'm going to briefly mention an application for disaster management. Jorge, in his introduction, already mentioned this briefly, that the CVI can be used to aid disaster management folk. The negociado para el manejo de emergencias y administración de desastres en Puerto Rico is by law tasked with coordinating operations before, during, and after a disaster. We did some statistical analysis that you can learn more about in the report, which we will show a link to at the end of our presentation. We found out that the Vega Baja zone, operational zone of the negociado, has higher child vulnerability than others. And this is important because this gives actionable insights to people who make decisions on how to allocate resources. So next up, I'm going to pass this on to Jorge, who will give you a demo.
All right. I think you can hear me. Yeah, I don't. Sorry about that. Yeah, I got my video working. Yes. Uh, Thank you, Laura. And I mean, as Laura was saying, this is a two-pronged tool. We do have a GitHub repository for anybody that is interested in working through that. There is an open source Python code in there that follows through the methodology and provides all the information that we've been sort of showing you here, and can be accessed and manipulated by people so that you can generate a index based on metrics that more attain to whatever you might be interested in. We've also produced a report about it that is on our website, and we'll link to it later. But I think our most front-facing or public-facing tool is the Child Vulnerability Dashboard, and which is available through our site, and it sort of shows the information that we gather in we hope, in an easy and accessible way for people to, not only communities, but also federal agencies or state agencies, to understand the vulnerabilities and necessities of children in their populations and better respond during or after natural events or hazardous events and prepare for them. But if we see here, for example, our tool is created in such a way that it can be accessed both in English and Spanish. When right now we're seeing this child vulnerability index at the municipal level, but if we wanted to see we're seeing it in English. But if we wanted to see it in Spanish at the municipal level, we could just click on the drop down arrow here and select municipio. But I'm not going to do that right now. In the left-hand side of the dashboard, we have a table showing the index for each municipio ranked from most vulnerable to least vulnerable. And we see here that Jayuya is the most vulnerable, followed by Barranquita, Mayagüez, Manatí, etc. And if we scroll down, we can see that Guaynabo is the municipio with the least vulnerability. We have two indicators that show the total population and the population under 18 years old. And right now it's showing it for the whole islands as is the map, which again also shows the vulnerability index, sort of similar to what we've been seeing in the other maps that Laura was discussing. We can also select here open the legend and see that a similar trend, like similarly to all the other maps, darker blue colors imply higher vulnerability. And just from the jump, we can see that there's a high concentration, or there's a concentration of vulnerability along municipios of the central region of the archipelago. To interact with it more, we can use the select a municipio filter, and this alters if we select different geographies. And say, for example, let's look at Jayuya. We can just type in Jayuya. Because it's the most vulnerable. And that way we can also, our two indicators change. Now we're getting the population for Jayuya and the total children population for Jayuya. We can also see a graph here that indicates the child vulnerability index, the overall vulnerability index, which is a 1, indicating that Jayuya is the higher, but we also see rankings based on all 3 themes in which we classified our data. And we can see that it has a high vulnerability on theme 1, which is the personal characteristics of children, high vulnerability, and theme 2, which is household with children in them, and a relatively low vulnerability. I mean, 0.5 or 2 in the ranking is still above the median, but it's relatively low to the other ones. And this type of information is important in considering our analysis, because from it we can determine that children in that municipio are vulnerable mostly based on the characteristics of children, not necessarily on the characteristics of the household, which might not be always the case. And we can sort of also, if we want to dig a little bit deeper into it, we can expand into the table below, and we can see the values of the variables that were used to calculate the index. And here we see, for example, that the poverty percent of children in Jayuya is 71%, which is almost 20 points higher than the average for the whole of the island, or the whole of the archipelago. And if we go into theme 2, we can see that close to 77% of children live in a household with one parent, with Laura already explained. It makes them highly vulnerable because it's highly linked to poverty in Puerto Rico, and 78%, it's not a surprise, live in households that receive some type of cash assistance, SSI, not SSI, but SNAP or something like that. And if we go to theme 3, for example, we can also see here that 15% of households in Jayuya have no vehicle. And Jayuya is a place that there's a rural municipio where people most likely need to drive somewhere or move somewhere to another municipio to get some other access certain benefits, say healthcare, or I don't know, to go to a government agency. So this is sort of how we expect people to use the dashboards and explore some of the information that's in it to sort of impact their communities for the best, or then gain knowledge so that disaster preparedness and management can be improved. The same analysis we can do at lower level geographies, like Laura was discussing. And I mean, in English, if we want to see a barrio, for example, we can go into the county subdivisions. And if you guys want to somebody wants to type in their barrio, like if you put in the name of your barrio or the community you grew up in or your family lives in the municipio, we can actually search for it right now. But I'll just do mine just to make it more appealing. I don't know. So I'm from Peñuelas. So if I type in Peñuelas here, I can search for Peñuelas. And I know I'm from El Barrio Jaguas. Actually, I learned this recently. I didn't know it, but and we can see here that where I grew up has a low child vulnerability, has a relatively low vulnerabilities in the themes related to children, but it does have a slightly higher vulnerability related to household composition. So it might be that where I live or where I grew up, like it's not necessarily vulnerability is not necessarily tied to children, but it might be more related to other factors of other housing. Maybe that there's more like elderly people or other housing concerns drive vulnerability in that area. And I don't see any comments in the chat, so I'll just finish up by saying that this is what we've created this with the hope that it benefits communities and that communities can leverage it to improve their conditions, justify their needs, or argue for their needs, not justify them, but argue for the needs and attentions that they should be given, and for government agencies to then better prepare and manage disasters so we don't have the loss of life that we've experienced in past events, or like lack of response that sometimes happens after disasters.
Thank you, Jorge. You can access the dashboard along with other resources from this project on our Centro site, as well as here on the QR code that will have available to you the Esri dashboard, the GitHub repo that Laura and Jorge had mentioned before, that has the open source custom Python code, the report related to this project, and as well as an ArcGIS hub site that contains the index data. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I would like to thank you all for attending our teach-in. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at centralrs@hunter.cuny.edu. And also please visit the Centro site to see more of our upcoming events. We hope to see you there. Thank you again.